All right, here we go.
Good morning. Good morning. Okay. Everybody's coming in. Good. Good.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. Super excited to be here today because I heard Joe do a different version of this talk a little while ago, and I was really impressed and blown away. I'm Karen Zidinga. I am the co-founder and experienced genius of SilverSTART, and Tim Bramwell, our co-host today, is also the co-founder of SilverSTART, and he is the business genius. We are also both serial entrepreneurs. Both have spent a lot of time working in the digital product space. Tim is a master at integration and technology. What is SilverSTART? It aims to redefine the entrepreneurial culture to be much more inclusive of people over 50 and help them create successful, mission-driven businesses. What is SilverSTART? Right now, it's a meetup group with chapters in Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, Victoria, Kelowna, Edmonton, and Ottawa. Welcome all. We meet on the third Tuesday of each month. Our guests are other SilverStarters who will share their experiences in fireside chats and presentations. We now also offer workshops and salons geared to the SilverStarters' unique needs. And we also now have a website, silverstart.ca. Yep, that's right, .ca. We're Canadian, eh? If you want to reach out to either of us, feel free to ping Tim or me through the meetup or at tim@silverstart or Karen with a Y at silverstart.ca. Now to our guest, Joe Tankersley. He is the founder of Unique Visions. He provides insights, imagination, and inspiration to help you transform your unique vision for a better tomorrow into reality.
Good morning, Karen and Tim and everyone else. Thank you guys for inviting me. I will say right off the bat that I'm convinced that in another life I was a Canadian, or at least I always aspire to be one. Canada happens to be one of my favorite places to escape to. Two bits of background before I dive into the details here. The first one is in terms of where I am in my entrepreneurial journey. I spent 20 years at Walt Disney Imagineering. In late 2014, I left there at the age of late 50s. And so I've been doing the entrepreneurial thing for about 5 years now. I don't know where that is with the rest of you in terms of making that transition to what may be the second or third career. But for me, it's been a really interesting adventure. I know I started out the first year or so simply going, if anybody walked in the door and was looking for someone to help them have insight into the future, I would say yes. And as a result of that, I got a lot of really interesting engagements. But part of what I learned was what other people thought I did well, which was interesting. The second, after a couple of years of that, it was time for me to decide what I did well. I started on an adventure of doing what all entrepreneurs do. I wrote a book. That took way longer than I thought it was going to. But it was an incredibly useful experience for me because it let me focus more on what really moved me and what was really interesting in terms of what I'm most focused on. And so over the years, over 5 years, I've seen some really interesting shifts as I try to figure out what is my third act. Hopefully that gives you some context. In terms of this particular presentation, back in March, when, at least in the United States, we started talking about COVID-19 in a big way, as a futurist, which is what my main job is, I realized that it was time to sort of sit back and watch, because we had shifted from any kind of thinking about longer term to really literally what happens tomorrow. For the first month or two, I did, like everyone else, try to figure out how I was going to get through day to day. But around May, I started to realize that people were starting to go, okay, there may be an after at some point, and we may need to start thinking about what that might look like so that we're better prepared for that. And as Karen said, I was asked by a group we're both a member of to put together a presentation on what that after might look like. That was in May. A few weeks after they asked me, we had lots and lots of protests on racial issues here in the United States. And suddenly the future had changed yet again. I did that presentation in June, and then Karen and I started talking about doing this with you guys. And obviously much has changed since then. So I will just caveat this by saying that while I hope it is relevant to people outside the United States, it does have a little bit of a United States lens on it. We are in many ways in a different universe than you are right now, unfortunately, but hopefully some of this will be useful. So with all of that said, let's see what I can share with you today.
we
Hopefully
go.
now you can see what I really think I look like, right? I don't know how many of you have ever actually worked with a futurist before or worked with somebody who did what we call strategic foresight. But the important thing that we want to always tell you is it's not about predicting the future. It's about making it possible for you to create the future, because the future does not exist. And the way we do this is we talk about probable scenarios, not necessarily all of them, but we look at different possibilities and think about what might be possible. Look for patterns, try to be ahead of tomorrow. That's really what foresight is all about, so that you can see the opportunities and the challenges before everyone else. But at the end of the day, this activity, and anybody can do this, it's not hard to be a futurist, it just requires looking beyond your area of expertise and thinking further out into the future. The other important thing to understand is the future will be fragmented. Futurists have a bad tendency to talk about the future. We pick a trend like automation, and then we go, everything's going to be automated, and that's what the world's going to be, because it's easy to do that. The truth is that the future is never one thing. It is always fragmented. Particularly, just look at what's going on with COVID-19 today, and you can see Canada, I'd say, is at least 4, maybe 6 months ahead of us in terms of their future with all of that. And probably coming out of this, your future will be radically different than what the United States will be. The important thing for you to know, though, is there are certain things you can't change: external factors, pandemics, global recessions, that kind of stuff. But there are other things that you can have an impact on. What we're really trying to do is to help you understand where your ability is and how you can actually use your personal strategies. And in terms of the pandemic, the overall message is simple. We know at this point, and I don't know that we knew this in March, I don't know in May we were convinced of this, but we know by now that the ripples from this global event are going to be widespread and likely long-lasting. Some of the latest economic forecasts out there are suggesting at least 2 years before we see a global rebound in terms of things like GDP. Other economic forecasts are suggesting it could be a decade. So it's going to have major impact. And it's not unexpected. Any kind of major, significant global disruption always has ripples. And it's the ripples that you want to focus on, because that's what you're going to either surf or you're going to drown in. And that's what we're really going to try to do today as we go through this. And as I look at everything that's going on with the pandemic and all of the changes that have happened, there's really one key term to keep in mind. There's essentially an accelerant. It's like pouring fuel on a fire. All of the things that we are seeing happen today, all of the trends, and that's what I'm going to talk about in a minute, are some specific trends, are things that we were talking about 6 months before we heard about COVID-19 in China. The difference was that they had been creeping along at an almost glacial pace in some cases. And then this disruption comes along, and in some ways, almost overnight, we see an exponential growth in these trends to match the exponential disruption that's going on. And I think if you understand what those trends are and how they're going to really impact your future, then you're going to start to think about new opportunities and new challenges to avoid. So let's look at some of those. The first one, and the one we all know, right, is remote work. And I don't know for all of you, since you're in the entrepreneurial space, if this was a big difference or not. I've worked from my home office for 5 years now. So for me, it wasn't a big deal. The big deal was my wife moving back into the house every day from 8 until 5, which has been interesting and a great experience. We've enjoyed it. We've been happy with it. But it's totally overnight. It answered this debate that had been raging in the business place for at least a decade. And people were in one corner or the other. It never will work. You can't expect people to work at home, or it's the greatest thing whatsoever. What we have found is it works. It may not be perfect, but for a huge number of knowledge workers or people in the thought industry or people in the service industry that's a professional service, you can at least do the work from home. The interesting thing in terms of its long-term effect is we're already starting to see a wide number of people who say, yeah, they do want to continue to work from home. Maybe not 5 days a week, but it's very likely that in most countries, you're going to start to see split weeks in the future. 2 days in the office, 3 days at remote, or vice versa, or maybe even, 2 or 3 weeks remote and then a week in the office. So that's going to be a major shift that is going to last. We're not all going to go back to the office. Here's an example of that I suspect many of you have probably had some kind of interaction with. When the COVID started, of course, the doctors didn't want you coming in to see them because you might be carrying the virus and they didn't want to get sick with everybody else. So suddenly telehealth took off. Because once again, it was a thing that has been around for over a decade, 2 decades, in fact. And it's been used in rural areas where there weren't any doctors physically available. Mm-hmm. What has happened almost overnight is we're seeing it used in urban areas and suburban areas. And most people are suggesting that for most appointments, it is at least as good as having to go drive to the doctor's office, and in the United States, at least wait an hour and a half before you actually get in because your appointment is never on time. This estimate here, talking about the 7-fold increase, that is based on what is happening today, not what was happening before today. So once again, you see a huge impact in terms of what that's going to be. Mm-hmm. The maker movement's another one that I think is a really interesting one in terms of COVID-19. I don't know how many people are familiar with this. Most people think about the makers, they think about things like 3D printing, making everything from prosthetics that have been printed and used largely by children who don't have access to that kind of equipment. There are people who are printing tchotchkes and selling them online. Once again, it's been around for at least a decade. It was the perfect opportunity for them when COVID-19 broke out. And this number here, almost over 7 million items, most of them ventilators, some of them protective clothing. And the interesting thing about the maker movement, there was no company that went out and hired all these people. There was no organization that said, hey, we're going to go out and start making face masks. Individuals and small groups of people just spontaneously organized. And that's a major trend that you're going to see in business in the future. An opportunity or a challenge arises, people have the ability to connect and go, this is what skills I have, and here I'm going to now solve this problem. And they were able to directly connect with the people who actually needed the problem. So it's a really important movement, I think, in terms of thinking about what the future of business might look like. Surveillance, of course, is another thing that has radically changed because of this disruption. And most of us talk about surveillance and the surveillance state and reference China, because that's certainly the place that is, I'd say, 5 to 10 years ahead of everyone else on the globe in terms of what they're actually doing in this area. But the tracing of potential carriers of COVID-19 is an irresistible reason to expand what seems like largely non-invasive tracing forms and surveillance. Particularly here in the United States, the argument has been around the Google and Apple apps that you carry on your phone. Without even being turned on or activated, you don't have to do anything whatsoever. Keeps a record of what other phones you interact with. So if you were later to turn out that you actually were running around potentially infecting people, then we could have access to that information. Now, largely because of lousy organization in this country, that hasn't been activated. There's been a lot of squabbles around it. But it's like going to the TSA when you go through the airport or any of the other things that happen over time. It's another chip away at the fact that in the next 5 to 10 years, privacy will largely be gone for most of us, at least in the public spaces. Automation, another one that everybody obviously is talking about, and I think in some ways may be the most important winner, if that's the right word, for what happens after this disruption. Automation, once again, been going on. We got warehouses that are using smart robots to move things around, typically engaging with people in close proximity. One of the areas we're starting to see, I think you're going to see a huge boom, is in terms of robots in the care business, caring for elderly patients, providing medical care. In some hospitals, since COVID-19 broke out, they're actually using sanitizing robots that go into a room and spray the room down after a patient leaves so that nobody has to be at risk of doing that. In Japan, they're already rolling these out across the entire spectrum of healthcare. You're going to start to see more and more of that. And then that friendly character up on the right-hand side of the screen there, that's actually a computer-generated artificial intelligence. Imagine Siri on steroids. So in the future, when you go to a chat room to try and get service, instead of making a phone call, you might go online. You might think you're talking to a person who acts completely like another human being, but that's going to be a chat box run by an artificial intelligence. The reason automation is going to take off is that even after the pandemic, businesses are going to think about what might happen next. And how can they avoid being disrupted again by anything that might be something that's going to do harm to people in their workplace? And so you're going to see a very obvious motivation to engage more and more with automation. That means prices are going to go down. That means it's going to expand across the board. Migration. This is an interesting one. If you talk to any futurist a year and a half ago, they would have told you that the gospel, according to futurists, is everyone's moving to big cities. We're all going to live in the big, giant metropolitan areas around the world. There were actually some indications that that was wrong even then, that people were starting to get tired of the hassle of moving to the big city, that the prices were keeping people from being able to move in. I know that's a problem in Vancouver. It's a problem in all the big cities on the West Coast, certainly. And people were already beginning to think maybe there was a better way. Well, and I don't know how it's happening in Canada, but at least in the United States, the minute COVID-19 hit New York, all of those people who had the capacity to leave, who either had a summer home or could afford to rent one for 6 months, left. And so you saw this huge top of the market disappear. And now they're seeing huge spikes in terms of real estate deals in places like Connecticut and Vermont, in the suburbs, and places where people want more space. My guess is all of those factors together are going to mean that that's going to continue to happen. And we're going to see in 5 years, probably, definitely in 10, a real interesting population rebalancing. That's an interesting thing for Canada, I would think, because you certainly have an awful lot of wide open spaces. You have a lot of smaller cities and towns that now could become new interesting hubs because we have the ability to be connected much further than we ever were before. Finally, collapse. This is the other thing that the COVID-19 has accelerated. And what it did was, like all major disruptions, it has revealed, pull aside the sort of covering and revealed those industries that probably weren't as robust and resilient as they should have been. Retail around the globe had already seen it's being driven more and more to online. In the United States, I think the latest statistics before COVID was something like 25% of all shopping malls would be gone by 2025. Now that number is just going up, and more damaging is actually a huge spike in terms of the non-big box stores. Though down here they're Walmart. I don't know, what are they in Canada? But the idea is that you're going to see more and more small retail groups actually disappear. In the restaurant industry, has been hit really hard here in the United States. I don't know how, if you guys are started to recover or not, but many of those are actually small mom and pop entrepreneurial opportunities, and one of the few places that have really seen a growth over the last 10 years. And now they're finding that they just don't have the depth of an economic basis to continue to operate. Another one that's really interesting for me, of course, is the meeting industry. A year ago, we'd be having this meeting in Karen and Tim's place, and we'd all be there, and I would have gotten on an airplane and flown up there, which would have been great because I would have been able to hang out in Vancouver. We are not doing that now. There is a lot of, I believe, unjustified optimism in the meeting industry that suggests it's going to bounce back quickly. I'm not so sure. I think people are going to be reluctant to travel. I think more importantly, businesses are going to be reluctant to spend the money to travel in the future. So I think you're going to start to see a lot of collapse in terms of all of that. So all of that is a wire hose, right? I've just sort of inundated you with all of these different things, and you're probably sitting there thinking, well, that's really great, Joe. What am I supposed to do with that? And actually, there are a number of different possible scenarios that can come out of that. I'm going to take a couple of minutes and just provide one, the one that I think is really interesting and a real opportunity, particularly for people in this group. There are other scenarios, and I would suggest all of you think about those same trends and maybe build your own possible scenarios as to what might happen. But I'm going to take you through this one I call the pandemic pivot. And Sir David Attenborough sort of cues it up for us. Any giant disruption, and this is a giant global disruption, makes it possible, particularly one that makes us pause for a few moments, to take a breath and to think about what we're doing. Because most of the time we don't have that ability. Most of the time it's, I've got a deadline, I've got to get here tomorrow, I've got to get on that airplane, I've got to go here, I've got to do that. We all, at least for a month or two, sat down. Some of us in the United States are still sitting down, still wondering what we really want to do with all of that. And so here are some of the things that have been talked about that we're starting to hear coming across the wire. The first one, of course, is thinking differently about the environment. And I'm sure everybody saw the meme that was talking about, oh, there were dolphins in the canals in Venice. There weren't, but the water was clearer than it's ever been. Places that have been suffering from massive over-tourism, particularly in Europe, are coming around to the fact that they really like having the streets back for themselves again. And so they're really questioning, do we really want to go back to that same pace? Do we want that same kind of business model that we had in the past? And then, of course, particularly started here in the United States, but spread around the globe very quickly. Well, discussions of, are we really confronting the issues of economic and racial equality throughout the globe? And is our economic system that exists today the one that's going to best do that? We now have something like 40 to 50% of the millennials, at least in this country, are suggesting that maybe there should be a capitalism 2.0 that we want to think about, something new about how we spread the wealth and make it more equal. And then for most of us, it's just simply the, my goodness, I sure was under a lot of stress in the old business model and rushing here and having to have that. I think one of the things that many of us have discovered, particularly when you don't get to go to the store, is there are a lot of things that you bought that you might not have needed. So there is this there's this sort of underlying kind of churn going on as we start to think about all of these things. And the possibility is that maybe now is the moment, is that we start to think about changing as we go forward and not going back to some kind of vision of the new normal, but something that is radically different, something that is completely different. And you read a lot of people talking about how this might mean that we become committed to the green economy, that we become committed to this version of a new capitalism 2.0. And if you want to know what that is, I would recommend Kate Raworth's book, Donut Economics. It's a great explanation of how you create an economic system that actually values both profit, planet, and people. So those are some of the things that are being talked about. Maybe now is the time for us to actually shift. And maybe this is something that's really relevant to all of you if you're also in this moment of shift, as if you've left behind a career and you're starting to think about what your new entrepreneurial exercise is going to be. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of advice about what that might look like or how you might build that if that's what you're interested in doing. The first one is, it is not easy. It's easy to imagine these things. It's easy to talk about a great new green economy, but there are real structural barriers to that. The first one is the entrenched powers are not interested in changing. The people who own the fossil fuel industries do not want us to see us going to solar energy. And you have seen that battle certainly in Canada over the last few years. That battle is going to continue to exist. There's huge economic fear right now. One of the things that is being hidden by all of the stimulus from the various government groups is the fact that we are taking a major economic beating at the local level across the globe. And people are terrified about what that might mean. And the final one is human nature. It's really difficult to get people to believe that there is something better and to take the risk on something that they don't know about. But at the same time, there is an opportunity. And if you're interested in doing this and creating some kind of mission-driven, some sort of social entrepreneur, or just something that imagines the world being different, there are a couple of tips that I can give you. The first one is there is a moment in time when it is easy to pivot. I've spent about a decade working with a nonprofit group that's main job is to provide disaster communication. And they're out of Florida, so mainly that's about hurricanes. And they've taught me something really interesting over the years. Every year at the beginning of the year in Florida, they go, oh, okay, new year, you got to start thinking about hurricanes. No one pays any attention to them. June 1st, they have the official announcement of hurricane season. A few people go out and check the batteries, might decide, oh, maybe I want to buy a generator or something like that. 3 days before the first hurricane shows up, everybody rushes out to the hardware store and buys all those things they don't have and buys all of the water that exists in the grocery store. And then we get through whatever the disaster is. And if it's a bad hurricane, and we've had a few of those in recent years, the next 6 months, maybe 9 months, is spent dealing with the trauma, dealing with the immediate problem. I don't have a roof anymore. I don't have a job anymore. My house may be completely gone. And all of the focus is there on the trauma, which is where we are now in terms of the pandemic. We're still really focused on the trauma. Then there becomes a moment. And once again, you in Canada may be closer to this, or you're certainly closer than we are. I don't know how close it is for you. But there comes a moment when people start to go, it's time to rebuild. It's time to get back into the groove of doing what we did before. And when that happens, if you're standing there with a good idea, a new idea, an idea they haven't thought about before, they will consider it. And that's your moment. That's what you want to be ready for. So you want to make sure you're building the story for what this new idea is. And then the other thing is, it's really simple. You sell that idea by framing it in economics. Most of the time, these new ideas aren't going to cost more. They're going to cost different. And if you can explain that to people and give them that opportunity, then indeed you can actually have a chance to pivot. So what will make that look like if we think about a pivot after the pandemic? The future that I imagine is something I call the digital renaissance, where we take all of those accelerating trends we talked about earlier, and we empower individuals to think about being different kinds of entrepreneurs, being actually more of a Renaissance person. And Renaissance people were interesting. They were artisans, they were craftsmen, most of them were marketeers at some level, many of them were merchants. So you might actually see the future as not starting a business, but starting many different businesses, or trying different things for short period of times, or working with different groups of people. It's very fluid, and that may scare people, but I think if you can get in the groove of that fluidity and thinking about that, then there's some really interesting opportunities that might exist there. And I think there are three things that might be useful to you if you want to think about something like this. The first thing is to refocus on values. There is a huge conversation going on about what is the real purpose of a business. And we're starting to remember that it's not just about making profit. It's about delivering real value to the whole community. And I think that's what we're really thirsty for. Rethink entrepreneurship. It's not finding a space downtown, opening a brick and mortar business, and thinking that you're going to compete with the other brick and mortar businesses down there. It's thinking about what people now call side gigs, right? You might have one or two small activities that you really just love doing that make a little bit of money, but not a lot. They go with whatever your big anchor activity that you're doing. And thirdly, reimagine community. Going forward, we're going to see success at the local level like we haven't seen for a really long time. And at the same time, we're going to have this really interesting possibility to connect with people in Vancouver and Orlando, in India, in Singapore, around the world, so that your community is going to be both local and global at the same moment. And that's going to be a completely different approach, not necessarily a mass market, but a niche market spread across many different time zones. So let me try to wrap this up for you by giving you something concrete, because I know this is a lot of abstract information, because as futurists, that's what we love. We love the abstract. And I'm going to just sort of try to identify some very specific ideas that hopefully will make all of this make sense to you. One of the things we're going to see as a result of the pandemic are empty spaces. So some of the things you can think about is how you might fill those empty spaces. Particularly real estate's the obvious one. They say in New York City there's going to be a huge opening up of commercial real estate. What opportunity would that give you if you are interested in a brick and mortar business? How might you rethink using that commercial real estate in different ways? What are the needs in Vancouver? Probably housing. Is there going to be real estate that's going to be available that might give us the ability to think about a new way of creating housing in the future? Services are going to see a lot of opening. And one of the ones I think is most interesting is those loss of all those local restaurants. What we've already started to see is that space is being filled by the restaurants going into the delivery business. There's a step beyond that that already exists, something called ghost restaurants. And what that is somebody opens a kitchen, a commercial kitchen. 5 or 6 different, quote, restaurants work out of that kitchen. They never have a front of house. They never have a place for seating. Everything is done by delivery. We're seeing that grow by leaps and bounds during the pandemic, and that's an interesting way to think about that going forward. In this new world, we're going to have to think about changing leadership skills, and we don't have people to train people how to do that. Dealing with virtual teams is different. It is hard. One of the reasons that businesses didn't want to go there was they didn't know what to do with middle managers. If you can figure out how to solve that lack, you have a huge opportunity. And then also, as we talk about more and more automation, we're going to be looking for opportunities for people who can actually lead the human and machine interaction as they work together. Disintermediation, the elimination of the middleman. That's the other thing that was really prominent across all of those trends. The maker movement is going to continue to be huge. How can you facilitate that do-it-yourself, that DIY sort of approach in moving forward in the future? What's your tribe as opposed to thinking about just customers? How do you cluster differently in terms of what you're trying to do? And finally, reimagining. How are we going to reimagine a world where surveillance is ever present? What can we do to protect people? What can we do to make the best use of all of that surveillance? And ultimately, do we need to start reimagining what a job is? Is it really something that is a 9 to 5, 40 hours a week, or is it something completely different? So just maybe some thought starters to get you guys started. I know I've gone on here for quite some time. I want to wrap up with this thought. I really believe that the opportunities in the post-pandemic are going to be about building resiliency. This is not going to be the last major global disruption we're going to see. Most people suggest that things like climate chaos, other, the elimination of forests and things like that are going to mean that we're going to be looking at a world where this kind of thing is going to happen more often. So businesses are going to need to be resilient. And I think we've reached a point where we know if we can't create equity, we are going to have huge social unrest. And so we just can't do that. And that, I think, is a great place to anchor anything you think about in terms of the future. And Karen asked me to leave you with a thought. So this is the one that I could think about. Is if you go back and look at all of those accelerating trends, which ones might offer you an opportunity to create your version of the digital renaissance? Is there something there that really maybe syncs with your past experience, or is there something there that really excites you and says you'd really love to have more and know more about that and really explore that world? And of course, I'll end with a shameless pitch for my book. If you're interested in seeing some other visions of what the future might look like, Reimagining Our Tomorrows offers some fun little stories about what those possibilities would look like. The idea being that they might prompt you to think about how you can create a better future for all of us and one that works for your own next act. So thank you very much for being indulgent and taking the time to listen to that. I'd love to hear your feedback now and hopefully what I can learn from all of you. Karen?
Thank you so much, Joe. That was wonderful, Joe. Thank you so much. And as always, inspiring. I love this idea of shifting focus from efficiency and productivity to resiliency and equity. I think that certainly I have just found myself sort of moving that way kind of naturally. I'd love to sort of get a sense from the group about, particularly around that idea of the difference to the shift towards resiliency and equity and how that sits with folks. Sean maybe had a comment around loving the positive and optimistic framing, and that's another thing I really enjoy about your talks generally, Joe, and certainly your book. The problem with the book is that it's over-inspiring. I wanted to do all of the things.
Joe, I have a couple questions for you. I took a whole page notes. Up front, you said basically you thought that, and I agree, you said 4 to 6 months ahead of opening up of the marketplace again, if you want to call it that, or the communities. And if there are some people on this call who wanted to offer services in the United States, how do you see that playing out? You talked about the demise of local restaurants. We've seen that a little bit here where restaurants are starting to open, but now in certain places there's more COVID activity, so there's talking about closing it. So there's a back and forth going on. But how do you see that playing out? How do you see the opening process happening in the States right now for people who may want to offer some services down there?
Wow. Right now it's truly chaotic.
Yeah.
I'm sure all of you have watched at some level what's going on down here. We have no national strategy. So what happened in Florida and a number of other southern states was we closed for a couple of weeks before the pandemic even got here, and then we all rushed out and said it's great again. Yeah. My gut says, at least from what I can follow right now, is we are going to slowly contract, and we may reclose the United States, or at least a big part of it, by August or September. One of the things that's really interesting happening down here is it's voluntary closures. Mm-hmm. People just aren't going out. People aren't doing business because they're terrified because it is such a mess. Mm-hmm. If I was trying to open a business to come into the United States, I'd look at next year. Really, I'm afraid mm-hmm. we're not your best customer right now. Okay. Although we definitely need you. There's no question about it.
I'm a Hannes educator, and I'm looking at the physical pain that everybody's in, especially holding onto the stress for a long time.
Mhm.
The somatic education is something that needs to be experienced in person. However, I'm having to go through a huge transition and figure out how to present it online.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a big challenge, right? If your business has been largely face-to-face, in person, some sort of physical connection, how you shift to online has been the biggest challenge, I think, for a lot of people.
The whole area of emotional well-being, as was alluded to in the beginning, is going to become a very big topic as we go through this, because with all the additional stresses of this, everybody had their own stresses prior to COVID, but obviously with COVID, there's been additional stresses. And so the adaptation, or the Joe called fluidity, the fluidity in making changes to that, some people are not good at that and will struggle with that a little bit. And so how that plays out emotionally on a national, regional, and international basis is one of the major areas that I'm actually watching very closely to see how people adapt to these things. Because I think some people are going to be better, and not that I'm a psychologist, but I would love to know how that can be mitigated in some ways.
Well, plus my strong suit, because I am a senior, is clearly not technology. Mm-hmm. So that's really challenging for me, that whole learning curve.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that, I'm a technologist, right? But I see a lot of work being done in the delivery of, Joe was talking about telemedicine, but I see it going beyond telepsychology. I don't know really what it is, right? But there's a lot of younger people who are looking at how to deliver those kinds of services. What they don't have is experience of dealing with a lot of people, right? So they have the technology understanding, but not necessarily so they can build an app, or they can, build a platform, whatever they're going to do. But in terms of delivering it, so, if you're not already, you might suggest connecting with some of these people and having conversations with them if that's of interest to you.
I think that's great. If I could just add one thought, a lot of people our age do give focus on the fact that we're not digital natives, and so learning the new technology is difficult. But I think what you just said should remind all of us that where our real superpowers is in resiliency. My 24-year-old daughter is great with her phone. She falls apart at the least bit of stress. That's an age thing, and one of the things is, for all of you, particularly if you're thinking about starting out on something new, that may be your core strength, is that ability to help people really understand how can you be fluid, how do you adapt to change, what do you need, and if we need to bring the young whippersnappers in to figure out how to use the apps, that's fine. They don't have that skill, because you have to live in order to get that skill.
We're already at the top of the hour. I can't believe that the time has passed so quickly. I just want to do goodbyes before we lose the rest of everybody. I'll share my screen really quickly and just announce the next meeting. So next meeting will be August 18th, 2020. The topic will be Weaving a New Pattern in Business and Life with Pam McGee, founder of McGee Cloth. She's an amazing woman who started essentially a textile mill on her property in Roberts Creek, which is a small town in British Columbia, and has started weaving in ethically sourced, beautiful cloths from ethically sourced fibers. Her first career was as a pharmacist, so it's quite an interesting change. If you want to find us online, there's Joe's LinkedIn, Tim's LinkedIn, and mine. Just search Joe Tankersley or Tim Bramwell or Karen Zaninga on LinkedIn. You'll find us. Yasmin, I think your comment is very interesting. I thought I was being ridiculous in wanting to start and run multiple new Relitech businesses, but it appears it's not ridiculous. It can be a path to greater resilience. Do you want to just elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I'm sort of midway through my shift. I had jobs in corporate Canada, got downsized, decided I didn't want to go back, and so I've been searching for a few years about what I want to do. And so I have made a couple of pivots, and now I'm looking at, I've just come to realize that the textile and fashion industries are like the #2 polluter in the world. And so there are a bunch of different things I would like to do. I wasn't sure where to
Mm-hmm.
start. So, I mean, one of the things I would like to do is start selling on Poshmark, because I have a lot of items I can get rid of, and that I didn't think of that as like a sustainable option. I thought it was kind of, I had to reorient my thinking around that. But I would also like to start a sustainable textile repurposing business, making masks to begin with, and then migrating to accessories. They're all interrelated, but I was thinking, you're ridiculous. You should just like do one thing. But I see
Joe says no.
No, it's for me, it's like a mindset shift, which I've been struggling with and sort of discounting the value of being able to do it. But I see now, like it actually is, I hate to use the expression, but more of a new normal, as opposed to, you know, I never really liked the idea of having a bricks and mortar store for to do things online. And I see that there are multiple ways to do it, and that I can do that doing more than one thing. So, you know, in a way I feel validated, because I thought, you're just being ridiculous. You know, I don't even know anybody who's doing that.
I totally hear you, Yasmin. I have, in the last year, started 2 businesses, a podcast, and reconstituting my consulting business. So yeah. And I also understand that sense of validation. And it was from Joe that I was talking to him about that idea. And you cover that idea too in your book, don't you, Joe? That sense of both repurposing, recycling clothing, in fact, is one of the stories in your book.
So let me I'll just very quickly say, the kids, I love to say this because I'm at that age, right? You know, the kids don't talk about being entrepreneurs. They talk about their side gigs. I actually have I know a young woman who's a really brilliant woman, about 30 years old. She lives in Toronto now, and she actually now signs her emails with, you know, her side gig and the name of it, whatever it is she's working on. And I think we have to reimagine entrepreneurship. I really do. And it's not easy. It doesn't suggest that's not incredibly complicated. But I think the exciting part about it is you get to try different things. And I never had one job for 40 years. I can't imagine what that would be like. You know, and so I think that's what's exciting, is that you get to try different things. You might do them for 3 years, 5 years. You might add some other things to it. And if you can keep fluid, there are a lot more opportunities, I believe, because of what's going on with some of the digital technology, particularly. So good for you. Great job.
Yeah.
That is really inspiring. I just want to say thank you. I love that idea of fluidity, and it's something I really needed to hear. Awesome.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. Joe, thank you for the presentation. It provided me a lot of really good information. I haven't started a business yet. I have a variety of different types of skill sets. And I've had maybe 3 or 4 different types of careers, and extremely different from like opposite sides of the spectrum. I've made a list of, you know, what I do well, and it could be 1 or 2, 3 things that are very different, but I guess I need help in how do I market that and how do I sell. One of them, for example, would be from a consultative perspective, and well, how do I sell the information that I have to provide on a consultative basis, where the other 2 ideas are a little bit different. So I guess I'm having a difficult time. Where the hell do I start marketing this? I'm pretty good with IT. Maybe not this Zoom, because it's the first time I've used it, so I'm not really good with sending messages, so my apologies. I'll get better at it, I promise. And if we're going to have any maybe future conversations about just that, as to how I can go ahead and start, that's where I'm having the difficulty, is the marketing and really how am I going to market this certain. It's not even a product. It's really a service, and it's a service that I believe people are going to need, based on you mentioning it, Joe, on under real estate deals, these suburbs where you think that perhaps that might increase in the future, where people leaving the city and perhaps wanting to, get out of the country. By the way, I'm in Toronto, Ontario. So, well, that's it, I guess.
So, Joe, do you have a perspective on beginning? It's one thing to say you may have a lot of side hustles, but where do you begin? What's your first focus? What's a step one?
So I was hoping to get some assistance on what would be my step one, to be quite honest.
Sure.
I'm not, my background isn't marketing or any of that. My background was in, as an information if you want to know, is lending, like mortgage lending, mortgage underwriting, all of that. And then in telecom and a few other things in between. I have a trade license and I like to bake. So there you go.
It's a very common problem. You're not alone, Francesca. It's.
I'm the last person to give marketing advice because I consider myself really bad at it. But the one thing the model that's worth looking at is look at what the game design industry does. They come up, particularly the online games and the app designers. What they do is they have an idea for a product. They prototype a good enough version. And this is, I think, a lot of problems for people when they're starting a new idea. They want it to be perfect before they put it out in the world. The app designers take the exact opposite. They come up with something that sort of works, and then they put it out in front of people to see what people think about it. Because there's that catch-22. If you go to people and say, what do you want? They're not going to know about something that doesn't exist. If you give them something that kind of works, that expresses whatever your value is or whatever your core service is, they're going to tell you why it works and why it doesn't work. And you're going to find out what part of them are going to go, yeah, I really wish somebody had given me that last week. So that's one idea. And you can do that quickly, and you try, different iterations and completely different ideas before you sink all of your money and all of your time into the one business that's going to be your future. So that's one idea that seems to work for people these days.
And the trick there is to really listen to the feedback, to tune in to the feedback and how that's going, and be ready to adjust, but also be ready to stop if it's not working. Too often we get in love with our idea, and we go and we go and we go, and we keep getting the negative feedback, and we're like, they're wrong. I'll just market more. It is important to stay balanced with that approach. You try and you get the feedback, and you are constantly assessing what that feedback is telling you. And honestly, and very, very brutally sometimes, rather than being in love with your baby, right? It's hard. It's in my experience working with a lot of people who have started that's the hardest thing to do, is not so much putting something out and trying it, but being willing to hear that maybe your baby is ugly, right? Maybe it's just not working.
I'd like to add, okay, I've been in marketing for 40 years. I've had my own business. I'm a serial entrepreneur, and I now have 2 businesses, both put online over the last year. A couple of things I've learned that marketing has changed. It used to be you created the product, put it together, and then put it out there, and that was what you're offering. Now we've got something called needs-based marketing, which is exactly what you're talking about. You basically have to do the one-on-one, you maybe do some focus groups, you go online and look at your competitors, what are they offering, what makes you unique, how can you package that, what kind of language, and then you take some online marketing workshops. So I think really, believe it or not, in certain ways, it's easier to get information because there's so much out there available online, and especially understanding your competitors. Mm-hmm. Just go to the website and see what they're talking about. So spend time doing the market research. I think that's the key.
I'm going to expand a little bit on what Joe was talking about, that because I'm in the I have a software development business. And so when we develop software, we look at what, I'm going to give it a name. We call it MVP. It's minimal viable product, MVP. And so we create an MVP product just to test our basic assumptions. And yes, sometimes the buttons all work, and a lot of times they don't, or they don't do everything we envision them to do. But in the same way, that's true in the software world. But certainly that approach is very usable in creating a business as well. And the thing is, I find a lot of people, I deal with a lot of people who say, I want to start a business and are in the same boat where they're not sure about how they're going to do it or when they're going to do it or whatever. And the nice thing about creating an MVP kind of philosophy or using an MVP philosophy is that you have to start, right? You have to start somewhere. And most people don't start. They get so afraid of whatever it is, I don't think it's going to be useful. I've got 3 friends, they all said they would never use it, whatever it is, right? You actually have to have enough faith in yourself to actually start. And once you do that, the momentum will pick up and you just keep going from there. You just have to sort of put one foot in front of the other and just keep on moving. And that's the hard part about being an entrepreneur, is starting the process. Once you're in it, it becomes easier and easier because you learn more and you already got to have a lot of information about how to do it.
Absolutely true. Beginning is the hardest.
Yeah. I'll just offer one thing to add to that, because all 3 of the comments you guys made are really perfect. I spent 20 years at Walt Disney Imagineering, and the myth is that Disney gets everything right. The reality is that we lived in an environment where we said we're going to fail 100 times before anything gets finished. And we used to build attractions, and from the moment we had the minimal viable product, we started play testing them with people. And invariably, whatever we thought was going to be hard was easy, and whatever we thought was going to be easy was hard. And so, Susan's right. Is that feedback loop that you have to create early on is the key, and you have to constantly be running it. And it's frustrating, but if you do that, you do get to the point where you want to be. So, it's great advice, I think, for anybody.
I just want to say thank you to everyone for sticking around, and what an interesting conversation it was today. And thank you again, Joe, for your amazing presentation. The comments in the chat are effusive. People really enjoyed it. I think they got a lot of value. So thank you for that. And I hope everyone will join us next month.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you guys for at least letting me visit Canada virtually today.
Yeah, welcome.
You're welcome anytime.
And best of luck to all of you with your new adventures.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.